I never thought something as ordinary as living in a suburban neighborhood would become a nightmare. My name is Ryan, and until a few months ago, I was just a regular guy trying to enjoy a quiet life in a quiet town. I paid my taxes, mowed my lawn, and waved at the neighbors during evening walks. But one day, everything flipped upside down, starting with a letter taped to my front door. At first, I thought it was some kind of joke, a violation notice from my Homeowners Association, my HOA, telling me I had committed several serious infractions that needed to be addressed immediately, but I had no idea what they were talking about. I hadn't done anything out of the ordinary. No loud music, no illegal construction, no wild parties, just me, my small garden, and the same gray siding my house always had. But the notice didn't just stop at the warning. It included a hefty fine, and it was only the beginning. I walked into the HOA office the next morning, confused and a little annoyed. Behind the desk sat Karen, the HOA president. If you've ever met someone who smiles with their mouth but not their eyes, you've met a Karen. She greeted me with that sharp, passive-aggressive tone that immediately told me she had made up her mind long before I walked in. "Oh, Ryan," she said, dragging out my name like it tasted bad in her mouth. "We've had several complaints. Your grass height is non-compliant. Your trash bins were out an extra day last week. And that flag you hang, well, it's not on the approved list of community decor." I was stunned. Seriously, grass height, a flag. This was absurd. "You're fining me for that?" I asked, trying not to raise my voice. "It's policy," she said, with a smile that looked more like a challenge. I left, frustrated but thinking it would blow over. But things only got worse. More notices arrived, more fines. Suddenly, I was being accused of things I hadn't even done. Someone claimed I let my dog run loose in the neighborhood. I don't even have a dog. I was cited for a noise complaint. At 2 a.m. on a night I was out of town, it became clear I was being targeted. My neighbors, once friendly and chatty, started avoiding me. I'd wave, and they'd look away. One morning, I found spray paint on my fence. Just a single word: leave. That was the day I realized this wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was personal. Someone wanted me out. The next letter from the HOA said I had 30 days to pay all my fines, now totaling over $14,000, or the association would pursue legal action to seize my home. That's when the panic really hit. I sat on my front porch for hours, rereading the notice. My home, my life. They were threatening to take it all. I thought about calling a lawyer, but good legal help costs money I didn't have. I'd always been careful with money, but I didn't have thousands of dollars just lying around. Then I remembered someone who might be able to help: my cousin, Derek. Derek and I had grown up together, but we hadn't been close in years. He'd gone into politics, worked his way through the city council, and a year ago, got elected as our town's youngest mayor. We hadn't spoken in a while, but this wasn't about pride. I needed help. I called him that night. He picked up on the third ring. "Ryan," he said, surprised. I explained everything: every notice, every fine, every ridiculous rule that was being twisted against me. There was silence on the line for a few moments. "I've heard things about that HOA," he finally said. "You're not the first to call me about them." So I asked him the question I'd been afraid to say out loud: "Can they really take my house?" He sighed. "Not without a long legal process. But if they push hard enough and you don't fight back, they'll make your life hell." That's when Derek promised to look into it. He said he couldn't make any promises, but he'd send someone from the city's housing department to do a quiet review. I thanked him and hung up, feeling a strange mix of hope and fear. Days passed. The notices stopped coming, but the silence was worse. It felt like I was waiting for a trap to spring. Then one evening, I came home to find a black SUV parked in front of my driveway. A man in a suit stepped out, holding a folder. "Mr. Ryan," he said, "I'm from the mayor's office. We've been asked to conduct an internal audit of your HOA." I invited him in and handed over every document, every letter, every photo I'd taken. He stayed for 2 hours, quietly taking notes and asking questions. A week later, something incredible happened. The local news ran a story: "Mayor orders investigation into HOA misconduct." I couldn't believe it. My small fight had reached the public, but the battle wasn't over. Karen wasn't the kind of woman to take things lying down. She called an emergency HOA board meeting, and I was invited. I showed up, palms sweating, heart pounding. The meeting was packed with residents, many of whom looked at me with curiosity, even suspicion. Karen stood at the front of the room like a queen defending her throne. She launched into a dramatic speech about community standards, about order and rules. Then she pointed to me. "And Mr. Ryan has consistently shown he does not respect those rules." I stood up. My voice shook at first, but I found strength in the truth. I laid out every violation that wasn't mine. I showed photos. I showed times. I played a video of my home security footage that proved I wasn't even home during one of the supposed infractions. Then I said something I hadn't planned. "And by the way, my cousin's the mayor. He's the one who ordered the investigation." The room fell silent. Karen's face went pale. She tried to regain control, but the damage was done. The residents were whispering to each other. Doubts were spreading like wildfire. That night, Derek called. "Nice move," he laughed, "but brace yourself. Barron's not backing down yet." He was right. 3 days later, I received a letter. The HOA was proceeding with legal action, everything. But this time, I had something I didn't have before: public support, media attention, and a mayor who had my back. I hired a lawyer with a discounted rate thanks to Derek's referral and prepared for the fight of my life. I sat at the edge of my bed, staring at the papers in my hand. The letter from the HOA was crisp, impersonal, and final. Due to ongoing violations and unpaid fees, the Homeowners Association has voted to initiate proceedings to reclaim ownership of your property. My hands trembled, heart pounding. The house I'd lived in for nearly 10 years, the home where I raised my daughter, where I planted trees and built memories, was being taken away from me over a dispute I didn't even understand. It wasn't the first notice. There had been warning letters, increasingly aggressive in tone. First, it was about weeds in my yard. Then the color of my mailbox. Then they said I left my trash cans out too long after pickup day. I made the changes they asked for. I complied. But it didn't stop. They kept coming. Fines for things I never did. Violations I didn't know existed. It felt personal. And that's when I realized it was. A few months earlier, I had spoken up at a community meeting about misused funds. I'd asked the board where the neighborhood maintenance fees were really going. The landscaping had grown shabby. The pool was constantly closed, and yet our fees kept rising. The president of the HOA, a smug man named Gregory Langston, didn't like being questioned. From that day forward, it was as if I had a target on my back. I called the HOA office to dispute the charges. To explain, no one answered. I sent emails, no replies. When I did get through, they told me everything was already in process. I asked to see the bylaws, the financial statements, anything that would explain their actions. I was told I could make a formal request, but it would take 60 days. They knew I didn't have 60 days. I tried to stay calm for my daughter, who was barely 7. I didn't want her to see me crying at night or losing sleep, but I was breaking inside. My savings were nearly gone. I was a freelance graphic designer, and work had been slow. I was barely keeping up with the mortgage, let alone surprise fines from the HOA. That's when my cousin Mark called. The same Mark who had once helped me install shelves in this very home. The same cousin who had spent summers with me as a kid, running barefoot across our grandmother's porch. Only now, Mark wasn't just my cousin. He was the newly elected mayor of our town. I hadn't told him anything about what was happening. I didn't want to seem like I was asking for favors. But somehow, word got to him, maybe through his assistant, or a mutual family friend. That day, he showed up at my door unannounced, holding a folder and looking more serious than I'd ever seen him. "I looked into your HOA," he said quietly, stepping into my living room. "And what I found is bad." He laid it out. The HOA board had been operating like their own little kingdom. Several complaints had already been filed against them, including one from a single mom who lost her house over a missing roof shingle. Another elderly man was fined thousands for unauthorized lawn ornaments, and when people protested, their concerns mysteriously disappeared from records. Gregory Langston, it turned out, had deep connections with a local real estate firm. Once homes were foreclosed, they were quickly flipped and sold for profit, often through Gregory's own recommended agents. My stomach turned as I listened. It wasn't just personal, it was predatory. A system built to profit off fear and manipulation. Mark promised he wouldn't interfere directly, but he said he'd launch a formal investigation into the HOA's practices. That gave me a little hope, but it didn't stop the foreclosure process. I still had weeks, maybe less, before they could legally begin eviction. I needed more time. I started gathering everything I had: old photos of the house, receipts from repairs, printouts of every email I'd sent the HOA. I spoke to neighbors, some of whom were too scared to talk, but a few admitted they'd been hit with strange fines too. One woman, Lisa, said they penalized her $200 for having a flag in her yard. Another neighbor, Mr. Howard, said the HOA made him repaint his door 3 times until he got the color right, and fined him each time. The next HOA meeting was open to the public. I decided I would speak. The room was filled with uncomfortable tension as I walked in. Gregory Langston sat at the head of the table, flanked by his boardman, of whom seemed willing to look directly at me. I waited until public comments were allowed, then stood up and told my story. I read from the notice I'd received, outlined the pattern of harassment, and then handed over a folder of evidence, dates, letters, fines, photos, all neatly organized. "You are trying to steal my home," I said, my voice shaking but loud enough to be heard, "not because of violations, but because I asked questions, and I won't let you do this to me or to anyone else here." The room was quiet. No applause, just silence. Then a few gasps when Gregory tried to interrupt me, and I raised my voice. "You don't get to shut me down anymore. After I left, I didn't know what would happen. But that night, Mark called again. He said the city attorney was getting involved. That formal complaints were now being reviewed at the municipal level, and most importantly, he'd put a temporary hold on all property seizures, initiated by HOAs in our district until the investigation was complete. I exhaled for the first time in weeks. A few days later, a letter arrived not from the HOA, but from the city office. It confirmed the moratorium on evictions, and said my case would be reviewed as part of a broader audit. Mark was keeping his word, but it still wasn't over. Gregory Langston wasn't going down without a fight. A week later, someone left a brick on my doorstep, no note, just a brick. Another day, I found a dead plant dumped on my lawn. And one night, my car tires had been slashed. I reported everything, of course, but without proof, there was little the police could do. I knew it was intimidation. I also knew I wouldn't back down. And then something shifted. More neighbors started coming forward. Lisa told her story publicly. Mr. Howard, to even a former board member, anonymously submitted financial documents. To the mayor's office, we were becoming stronger together. What started as a one-woman battle was turning into a movement. After the confrontation at the meeting and the letter from the HOA attorney, I knew things weren't going to cool off on their own. That next morning, I received a violation notice taped to my front door. It was printed in bold red letters, stating final warning, removal of unauthorized shed within 48 hours. I stood there staring at the paper, trying not to let my hands shake. It was just a shed barely 8 by 10 feet, tucked behind my garage and not even visible from the road. I had gotten it a year ago to store my tools after my garage flooded. No one had said a word about it until now. But this wasn't about the shed. This was personal now. The neighborhood felt different. I used to wave to my neighbors as I watered the lawn, or chat with Carol across the street about her grandkids. But now, garage doors stayed closed. When I walked by, people turned away when they saw me. I could feel their silence like pressure on my chest. I knew what the HOA board was doing. They wanted to isolate me, wear me down, make me comply. But I wasn't going down without a fight. I called my cousin. He was busy, as always, but he answered immediately when I told him what was happening. They taped a notice on your door. That's borderline intimidation, he said, voice sharp. You're not alone in this. He wasn't exaggerating. My cousin Sam had a long history in city politics. He had worked his way up from district council to now being mayor of our town. He had always been the kind of guy who didn't like bullies, whether on the playground or at City Hall. I want to help, he said. Let me look into how far their authority actually goes. Within 24 hours, Sam sent me copies of the city's zoning laws, local ordinances, and homeowner rights documents. I pored over the pages, highlighting and taking notes. It was empowering, like arming myself for battle. I realized the HOA was overstepping in several areas. For one, they had never filed the proper paperwork for some of their policy updates. Second, they were issuing fines without giving fair hearing opportunities. I made copies of everything and sent them with a formal rebuttal letter to the HOA. It was respectful but firm. I asked for a proper hearing with an impartial arbitrator and demanded they cease sending fines until the hearing was complete. I cited the laws, the sections, even included city documents. It was a solid letter, but they didn't back down. 3 days later, I got another letter. This time, they claimed my backyard fence was 2 inches too high and obstructing the neighborhood's uniform view line 2 inches. I had measured that fence myself when I built it 3 years ago. Number 1 had raised an issue until now. It was petty, vindictive, designed to make me feel small and helpless. Then, something happened that made it worse. Late one night, I heard a loud crash outside. I ran out barefoot, heart racing, to see that someone had smashed the side mirror off my truck. There was no note, no sign of who had done it. But I knew, whether it was a board member or someone they had stirred up, this wasn't just about rules anymore. It was war. The next morning, I filed a police report and called Sam. He wasn't surprised. That's vandalism. I'll talk to the city attorney. This is getting out of control. Sam was calm but serious. He told me to stay firm, document everything, and not retaliate. I followed his advice, installing a camera over my driveway and keeping every letter, notice, and interaction in a binder. I was building a case, slowly, carefully. And then came the big one. The HOA sent a certified letter stating they had voted unanimously begin foreclosure proceedings on my property if I did not pay the accumulating fines and remove the violations within 2 weeks. They were threatening to take my home. I sat there, the letter in my hand, for what felt like an hour. It didn't seem real. This was the house I had lived in for 20 years. My kids had grown up here. My wife had painted every room herself. We'd planted trees in the backyard when they were just saplings, and now they shaded the deck in the summer. This was my home. I was furious and scared, but I wasn't backing down. That same day, Sam came over. He had a file under his arm and a look on his face I hadn't seen before, focused. protective, ready. You have options, he said, and they just made a huge mistake. Sam explained that foreclosure by an HOA is only possible under very specific conditions, and even then, it requires proper legal filings, hearings, and a court order, none of which they had. He also pointed out that they had violated city laws by issuing fines without a hearing and misrepresenting their authority in their correspondence. He made a few calls. That week, a notice went out to the HOA board from the mayor's office, requesting a full audit of their policies and actions. A city compliance officer was assigned to investigate any overreach or abuse of power, and something shifted. The board, which had been so aggressive, suddenly went quiet. No more letters. No more new violations. My mailbox, once stuffed with threats and fines, was empty for days. Neighbors began talking again. Carol waved at me as she carried groceries. Tom from down the block came by and said, "Heard you gave the HOA a wake-up call," but I knew it wasn't over. Not yet. Then came the official hearing. It was scheduled for a Friday morning at City Hall. I brought everything: my binder, the photos, the letters, and a prepared statement. Sam sat beside me, not as mayor, but as family. The room was quiet, the board members sitting stiffly across from us. The compliance officer led the session, going point by point through each accusation, asking questions, demanding evidence. When it came time for me to speak, I stood up and told my story. Calm, clear, no anger, just the facts. I spoke about the intimidation, the notices, the vandalism, the lack of proper hearings. I ended with a sentence that came straight from the heart. I just want to live in peace in the home I built with my family. The board tried to defend themselves. They claimed I had ignored multiple warnings and that rules were rules. But the compliance officer wasn't buying it. She asked why their violations suddenly increased after the shed incident. She asked why they hadn't allowed a proper hearing before issuing thousands of dollars in fines. They had no good answers. When it was over, the officer said she would review everything and issue a formal decision within 10 business days. I left the room feeling something I hadn't felt in months: hope. By the time I walked out of that room, I wasn't just angry, I was focused. My heart wasn't pounding in panic anymore. It was steady. I knew I had to act fast. These people were serious, and if I waited, they'd take everything. They'd bulldoze my house with my memories in it, and I wasn't going to let that happen. That night, I called my cousin again, this time not as family, but as someone who could make things move. I told him everything. Every fine, every notice, every time. They ignored me when I asked for clarification. He didn't interrupt me once. He listened quietly. Then he said 4 words I hadn't heard in a long time from anyone. "That's not right, man." I could tell something inside him clicked. He promised to look into it first thing in the morning. Meanwhile, I stayed up going through every single paper the HOA had sent me over the years. I didn't want to miss anything. I highlighted inconsistencies, added sticky notes where dates didn't make sense, and created a timeline on a big piece of cardboard. I was turning my kitchen into a war room, and in that moment, I realized something. I'd been afraid of them for too long. By morning, my cousin called back. His tone was different this time, tighter, more alert. He'd found something in their filings, something big. Apparently, the HOA had been levying fees that weren't even legally voted on. They were collecting them quietly, outside of what the homeowners had agreed to. In simple words, they were breaking their own rules. He also told me he was sending over a legal advisor from the mayor's office, not to sue, at least not yet, but to officially review the actions of the HOA as a third party. This wasn't just a family favor anymore. It had become an official investigation. The news spread like wildfire. Neighbors who hadn't talked to me in years suddenly wanted to check in and see how I was doing. A few even admitted they had been bullied by the HOA too, but were too scared to speak out. One older woman, Mrs. Fallon, came over with a folder. She said they'd fined her for excess garden gnomes. She wasn't kidding. That was the actual term used in the notice. With every story I heard, I got angrier, but I also got stronger. We weren't dealing with a few bad rules. We were dealing with people who thought they were untouchable. But they forgot one thing. My cousin knew how the system worked, and I was no longer willing to play victim. The legal advisor came the next afternoon. She was young, but sharp like a knife. She went through the documents with a look I couldn't read, then asked if I could gather a few neighbors for a group meeting. We met at my place, 7 of us, all with different experiences, all with stacks of papers showing strange fines, vague warnings, and threats that felt more personal than professional. The advisor took it all in. She asked precise questions. She took notes. And then she said something that made us all sit up. If even half of this is verifiable, this HOA is not just unethical, it's illegal. That was a turning point. But the HOA wasn't going down without a fight. The next day, I got a notice taped to my door. Not mailed, taped like a message. It said my home was officially scheduled for seizure due to non-payment of cumulative fines. They gave me 10 days, not 30, not even a hearing, just a cold, quiet threat. But now, I had something they didn't expect. Support, and a growing file of legal violations. My cousin set up a public meeting and open forums, so the mayor's office could hear from residents directly. It was rare, and the HOA wasn't happy about it, but they couldn't stop it. That night, we packed the community hall. People came with folders, photos, some with tears. One man stood up and said he was fined for painting his shutters the wrong shade of brown even, though he had HOA-approved color samples. Another woman described being fined for putting up holiday lights before the approved date, which wasn't even published anywhere. Each story was a crack in the HOA's armor. Then it was my turn. I stood at the podium, looked out at a crowd of faces I'd once avoided, and I told them the whole story. I didn't yell, I didn't blame. I just spoke the truth. About the threats, the lies, the pressure, the fear, finally. About how this wasn't just about one man losing his house, it was about power being abused. When I finished, the room was silent. Then someone clapped, then another. Soon, everyone stood, even the advisor, even my cousin. The next morning, the local news called. The story had gone public. The headline read, Mayor's Office investigates rogue HOA practices in quiet neighborhood. The HOA tried to save face. They claimed errors in communication, said they were reviewing internal policy. But it was too late. The investigation had started. Lawyers were now involved. And the State Housing Authority had opened a compliance review. They called an emergency board meeting. But for the first time ever, it wasn't closed door. We had press, we had legal observers, and we had community members who weren't afraid anymore. When the meeting began, the tension was thick. The board members who once barked orders now looked like deer caught in headlights. Their lawyer was present, flipping through papers with a look of rising panic. Then came the bombshell. The legal advisor stood up and read a statement from the mayor's office. It said that until the investigation was complete, no further property seizures were allowed, all current seizure notices were suspended, and all fines levied in the past 2 years would be reviewed individually. The room exploded with applause. People cried. Mrs. Fallon actually threw her garden gnome into the air. And me, I didn't cheer. I just exhaled. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. I walked outside after that meeting, looked at my house, and realized I had won something bigger than just a home. I had won my peace, but it wasn't over yet. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the neighborhood. I watched from my porch as some of the same HOA members who had once marched toward my home with smug smiles now walked by. Silent, barely making eye contact. The atmosphere had shifted completely. The power they once wielded was gone, not because I destroyed it, but because I exposed it. And once something like that is dragged into the light, it doesn't survive long. My cousin, Mayor Tom, didn't come by immediately after the council ruling, but he sent me a short message that meant the world. Told you not to back down. Proud of you. Those few words carried more weight than 100 handshakes. A few days later, I received an official letter from the city's legal department. It confirmed the reversal of the HOA's actions and ordered a temporary suspension of the entire board pending a full investigation. That meant they had no legal authority until the process was complete. I sat on my porch holding that letter, overwhelmed with a mix of relief, exhaustion, and cautious hope. My home was safe for now, but I couldn't relax yet. The deeper rot still needed to be cleaned out. News of the HOA scandal spread quickly, especially after a local reporter ran an in-depth feature titled The Neighborhood Coup, Power, Property, and Corruption in the HOA. It aired on TV and was shared all over social media. Neighbors who once avoided me now knocked on my door not with judgment, but with questions. They wanted to know how I fought back, what really happened, and how they could protect themselves. That's when I realized this wasn't just about me anymore. I started hosting weekend gatherings at my house. Nothing formal, just open conversations over lemonade and sandwiches. People came with their stories. Unfair fines, strange fees, threats of foreclosure over minor issues. The more we talked, the more we realized how systematic this abuse was. It wasn't just 1 or 2 people on the board. It was a whole network of silent power passed through meetings most residents never attended, and policies that were never explained clearly. Some neighbors were hesitant to join the push for change, still afraid of retaliation, but others, especially those who had been hit the hardest, were ready. Together, we began organizing for a full HOA election recall. We circulated petitions, filed paperwork, and started educating people on their rights. I found myself stepping into a role I never wanted, the reluctant leader of a neighborhood rebellion. But with each step, it became less about rebellion and more about responsibility. No one should feel powerless in their own home. Tom helped quietly behind the scenes, offering legal insight and ensuring we stayed within every rule. He couldn't publicly endorse the effort, being mayor demanded a certain neutrality, but I knew he was with me, and I needed that strength more than I cared to admit. The HOA board didn't go quietly. They hired lawyers, held secret meetings, tried to rally support by fear-mongering, if we go, who will protect the community from chaos? But the truth was, people had already seen the chaos, the petty fines, the threats, the whispered gossip used as weapons. We didn't need protection from outsiders, we needed protection from our own system. The day of the recall vote was hot and tense. More residents showed up than any HOA event in years. Young, old, longtime homeowners and newer families, people were awake now. The board tried every trick they could, but the turnout was undeniable. The vote wasn't even close. Every board member was recalled. It felt like we could all finally breathe. A new board was formed, made up of people who had shown up at my porch meetings. People who had asked questions, shared concerns, and actually listened. And while I didn't run for a position myself, I supported each one of them through the process. In the months that followed, things began to heal. Some of the old board members moved away quietly. Others stayed and kept their heads down. Policies were revised. Budgets became transparent. And the fines and fees that once hung like storm clouds over people's homes began to fade. My home stood, unchanged in structure, but full of new energy. I repainted the porch railings, planted new flowers along the walkway. And every time I looked at the front door, I smiled, not just because it was still mine, but because I'd earned the right to protect it. One morning, I heard footsteps and looked up to see Tom walking up with a coffee in hand. He didn't say much, just handed me the cup, sat down, and nodded at the neighborhood. "You changed something here," he said. I shrugged. "We all did." He smiled. "But you lit the match." We sat in silence. The kind of silence that feels peaceful, not awkward. The kind you earn after a long, hard fight. As the days went on, I started hearing from people outside the neighborhood, other homeowners across town, even from different states, who saw the news story or read about our battle online. They asked for advice, templates, legal suggestions, and I gave it, not because I was an expert, but because I had been in the fire and come out standing. Eventually, I wrote a short guide and posted it online. Fighting Back, a homeowner's guide to HOA abuse. It wasn't flashy, just honest, step-by-step strategies, sample letters, and a clear message: you don't have to be afraid. I never wanted to be an activist, but maybe that's how change really starts. Not with people who want power, but with people who just want peace. My home, once just a house on a quiet street, became a symbol of something bigger. A place where the system tried to break someone, but failed. A place where one homeowner stood up, and then another, and another, and another, until the silence cracked and the truth came pouring out. And now, when the wind rustles through the trees and I hear the sound of kids playing down the road, it doesn't feel like just any street. It feels like a community again. And this time, it's one we've built together.